All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the first in our fall 2024 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability here at Westchester University. And I'm very glad to see those of you who are with us in person and those of you who are joining via Zoom today. Just a couple words of introduction before I turn the podium over to our speaker today. Wanted to, excuse me, thank the co-sponsors of the Research and Practice Seminar. The Office for Research and Sponsored Programs has been a co-sponsor of this series since 2017, as well as the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. We're grateful for their support, and they've allowed us to run this series for going on an 8th year now that we're kicking off this fall 2024 series. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Dean Johnson. He's a professor of philosophy and affiliated with the Women and Gender Studies program here at Westchester University. He describes himself as an interdisciplinary activist scholar and a consultant for nonviolent campaigns and initiatives. His topic today is building sustainability through conflict transformation and a just peace. And I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Dean Johnson.
Well, thank you all for being with us today, whether it's virtual or here in person. I know that we're in week 4 and things are already pretty busy for many people. So taking the time for events like this is important for connecting with one another and for staying on top of things in terms of the topics of the day and what becomes important. Just before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to thank the organizers and sponsors of the series as well. And also, and since that was just done a moment ago, I want to just lift up how helpful Callie has been in this organizing and work. So thank you to the sponsors and thank you for your work in this. While I was thinking about what I might say today, I thought it might be useful to give an orientation to just my general. My academic background comes through peace and conflict studies, which is interdisciplinary, as well as religious and theological studies. So as I started into this work initially, and thinking about what is peace, what is justice, it comes initially from a theological and religious orientation. My activist background comes through a Kingian legacy of nonviolent social change. And I'll mention a couple of those people today who've had a bigger influence in how I think about things. But when I say a Kingian legacy, I'm referring to Martin Luther King Jr. and the tradition of carrying out social change through his orientation of nonviolence. My general orientation is relational, transformational, and transgressive, I would say. My work is heavily influenced by Vincent Harding, Martin Luther King Jr., Grace Lee Boggs, Bell Hooks, John Paul Lederach, and Ruby Sales, among others. But as I've been thinking recently about these particular topics, those are the people who keep coming to me. All of these people focus on relationships and community, especially what Dr. King called beloved community. And I'll just add to that, when I say beloved community, I'm thinking about how do we pull people into relationships with us? But also, who are the people that we lean on? I apologize. Who are the people that we lean on? So when you think about your own personal beloved community, maybe think about that group of people, those 1 or 2 people, or maybe more that you call when you're really excited about what's happening in your day, in your life, who are probably the same group of people that you call when things are not going quite so well. And then maybe in the midst of that, as you're telling them why things aren't going so well, things aren't feeling so good, they might actually hold you to a loving accountability and saying, help me understand what was going on. That doesn't seem like you. So they might call you out or call you in to a conversation in a different way. So I start to think about sustainability and relationships in that kind of orientation. And I tend to center the ideas of revolution and revolution of values. And when I say revolution here, I'm not talking about let's go overthrow the government. What I'm talking about is what Grace Lee Boggs would refer to as revolutionary change, that our evolution to new ideas and new ways of being when old things aren't working for us. So revolution, as I'm using it, means starting anew, thinking of new ways of being. So just to give you a few quotes from some of those people who've been really pressing on me, at least as I've thought about this. The quote comes from Doctors King and Harding, from a speech that Dr. King gave at called Beyond Vietnam, Time to Break the Silence. It was probably considered his most kind of radical speech. It was given a year to the day before he was assassinated. And as a part of that, he really was holding society to account for multiple ways of being. And the reason I put Dr. Harding's name along with that is because Vincent Harding was the initial drafter of that speech. He was a part of King's Inner Circle. He's also someone that I worked very closely with through my PhD work. He became a mentor of mine, and we kept in touch until he died just a few years ago. But from that speech, when I give this quote, as I've been thinking about the topic, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. End quote. Another quote comes directly from the work of Dr. Harding. He says, quote, "Education has an essential role to play. The only way that we can carry on and expand upon the nonviolent philosophy of Gandhi and King is to make it a central part of what we teach. It seems to me that most children and even adults have no idea that there are other ways of achieving justice besides resorting to the use of destructive force and retaliation. This is why it is so important that education provide a vision of an alternative way of life." End quote. I mentioned Grace Lee Boggs. Grace Lee Boggs was a philosopher and activist elder who lived in Detroit for most of her adult life, 60 years. She died at the age of 100, and during that time, she did a profound amount of organizing in the city of Detroit. If you are an activist in Detroit doing community organizing work, you were probably in her house at some point talking about strategies and tactics with her. She writes in her book, The Next American Revolution in 2012, quote, "With the end of empire, we are coming to an end of the epoch of rights. We have entered the epoch of responsibilities, which requires new, more socially minded human beings and a new, more participatory and place-based concepts of citizenship and democracy." End quote. She's also attributed with saying, quote, "We are at one of the great turning points in human history when the survival of our planet and the restoration of our humanity require a great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual values." End quote. So holding King and Harding and Boggs in the back of our minds, I also want us to think about, well, what is this thing called conflict transformation? So conflict transformation is really it's a lens of seeing things. So it's about how we understand conflict to work in our lives, in societies, in our relationships. And we should keep two ideas in mind. The first is conflict is a natural and necessary part of life. It is only through conflict that change will occur. So just to put that into some perspective, things will go along as they are until someone says, well, wait a minute, that's not working for me. So there has to be some, at least initial conflict that says whatever is happening is not working. The second part of conflict transformation is thinking about relationships. Relationships are central to making change. And this comes from an understanding that we live in a web of relationships tying us together. So when I think about pursuing peace, when I think about sustainability, what becomes central to me is relationships and how we are thinking about relationship. So my most recent research has been focused on political polarization. Super fun topic. Lots of people are talking about it right now. And when I think about political polarization, it's actually, for me, the opposite of sustainability and how we think about sustainability. Polarization is about destroying our connections to one another, while sustainability is about dependency on one another and solidarity. If you want an example of that sense of sustainability and dependency on one another and building that sustainability, if you have not, you should take a look at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. All of them are dealing with what is our relationship to one another. So the political polarization in the United States is worse now than it has been in decades. According to a fall 2023 study by the Pew Research Center, quote, ordinary Americans are more polarized than in the past. Partisan divisions on issues are wider now than they were a few decades ago, and many Americans hold deeply negative views of those on the quote other side of politics. So there's always been political divides, and healthy debate should always be a part of civic engagement, civic discourse. But what we're experiencing at this moment seems a bit different. We see more grandstanding and less humility in political conversations. Many Americans feel there's no center or commonality. There's nothing holding the extremes together. This gets exacerbated by political rhetoric that is less fact-based, less collaborative, and more combative. And in addition, around 6 in 10 US adults, so about 61%, say having political conversations with people they disagree with is generally stressful and frustrating. While about 36% say these types of conversations are generally interesting and informative. So a little bit of a divide on how people are feeling about being with those who they're not so sure about. Critically, because many people are conflict avoidant, they retreat to places of comfort among people with whom they feel safe. As politics have become more vicious, people do not know who they can trust to engage in political discourse. This, of course, only deepens the polarization. The cycle of fear and retreat recreates political polarization and further breaks down relationships and trust among and within communities. So we're thinking about sustainability being built on relationships. What we're dealing with right now is actually a push toward the opposite way of thinking about that, or being that way. The polarization we are experiencing is fueled by multiple factors, including but not limited to what has been called political demagoguery, an intentional created lack of historical understanding, and isolation driven by the pandemic. And we are living in a time of backlash to decades of progressive movements for a more inclusive society, the presidency of Barack Obama, and the shifting demographics in the United States. So all of those things kind of swirl together. So the way things, the systems and the way things have been set up are not as dominant as they were before. The anxiety promoted by these changes has provided an opportunity for political demagoguery, which Patricia Roberts Miller says is discourse that promises stability, certainty, and escape from the responsibilities of rhetoric by framing public policy in terms of the degree to which and the means by which, not whether, the out-group should be scapegoated for the current problems of the in-group. So where do we start to hear that in politics? And it's not just one side, it's how is that being when we're pitted against one another as part of what's going on. So some of our current political leaders have whipped up support by advocating for different reclaiming the different ideological understandings, intentionally to perpetuate the idea of victimhood among those who have more recently been in power, which tends to be those who are white, Christian, cisgender, heterosexual men, as well as to stoke fear and distrust among and within communities. So who do we trust? Who are we not trusting? Alongside that demagoguery is the decades-long problem of how history is addressed in K through 12 education. Scholars and activists have questioned for a long time the writing and teaching of history textbooks. K through 12 history curricula tend to focus on war, legislation, and national events and leaders, but rarely discuss the histories of everyday citizens and locations. And recently debates about which histories can be taught and how and what can be taught has become a part of the political polarization. The result is a less educated citizenry, which often seeks out information from unreliable sources or sources that only reinforce what they believe to be true. And in everyday discussions about history do occur, people often experience anxiety about what they do or do not know and how one expresses that knowledge. So how do I even get into a conversation about what's going on right now? Finally, I would say the COVID pandemic dramatically affected political polarization in at least two ways. First, many politicized the pandemic, creating an us-them approach to lockdowns, vaccinations, economic boost. Scientists, doctors, and educators were vilified, and regardless of what side the debate one was on, one was often dehumanized and presented as ignorant or untrustworthy. Second, the periods of isolation and lockdown eroded relationships and communities. People lost a sense of belonging to a larger community and sought refuge in familiar and already established relationships. So again, going back to the relationships build sustainability, political polarization has been on the rise for decades, according to Rachel Kleinfeld of the Carnegie Foundation. Kleinfeld's research shows that political polarization has been on the rise among politicians who show little overlap among their political beliefs. So really what she's saying is among politicians, there is a huge divide. There's little overlap, say, among members of Congress in the things that they agree on. However, the general public is not as polarized as politicians on most major issues such as climate change, gun safety, reproductive health. The shift in attitudes among the general public stems from a longstanding distrust sown by political leaders. So what Kleinfeld is talking about is something that was brought to my attention by a colleague named Amanda Singer a couple of weeks ago in work we were doing together called basically affected polarization, which is emotional polarization. So members of the general public are caught up into what she refers to as kind of emotional polarization, which is fueled by the popular political narratives. Okay, so we're not as far apart as what we seem to think we are, but because of the political rhetoric of us and them, we tend to need to feel like we need to choose sides. And then this is sowing a level of distrust. Conflict transformation elder John Paul Lederach wrote in his book, The Moral Imagination, almost 20 years ago, quote, politics, economics, and global structures have become so inauthentic that few of us truly believe in them. We live in this paradox. The things most omnipresent that govern our lives are the very things from which we feel distant. We hold fast to the myths that what we have created to govern our lives is responsive to whom we are as human beings and to our communities. Yet at the same time, these creations appear to have lives of their own, independent of us, foreign to us, and distant from us. So we're seeing this level, again, of distrust of how the systems that are supposed to be in place to move things forward, to help communities out for decades now. There's been an ongoing distrust that those systems are actually working. Political polarization is driven by politicians who have sown distrust against their rival political party. Seinfeld's work demonstrates that the end result of this distrust is that people are willing to overlook bad behavior by their party or party leaders in order to beat the other party. And so what becomes then important is winning. What's going on ethically and morally within the different leadership frameworks becomes more irrelevant. In other words, people overlook the bad behavior for the sake of winning because they distrust the other side so much. Sustainability pays the price. It does not matter if the general public shares political desires as long as they believe the other party is against them. So and that's a big downer for lots of people. You know, that's not, my work is not going away anytime soon in terms of thinking through these sort of things. So what are some of the proposed solutions? How have I started to think about this and work at this a bit differently in my work? So we're not going to survive as a species or a planet if we do not figure out how to create solidarity in community. That's why we have to figure out how to be in relationships with one another because our very livelihood and future depend on it. I return to Boggs, who says, quote, "We must have the courage to walk the talk, but we must also engage in the continuing dialogues that enable us to break free of old categories and create the new category ideas that are necessary to address our realities. Because revolutions are made not to prove the correctness of ideas, but to begin anew." So over the past 20 years, my research, writing, and teaching have been encouraged with these things that polite society says we shouldn't talk about. So my work actually in the classroom is to say, we're told not to talk about these things. Often the polarizing topics of religion and politics. So what are we going to talk about in this peace and conflict studies class? Religion and politics, the things that we whisper about, that we may not say out loud. And one of my focus of my pedagogy has been in reducing fear and anxiety among students. And so if the idea is that people don't trust one another, then what are we doing to overcome that? So I help them develop relationships and safe spaces with their classmates so that when we discuss those difficult and often emotional topics, students know and trust one another. I employ pedagogical tools which are heavily influenced by the frameworks of peace, justice, and conflict studies. And my focus is on creating opportunities for what I call transformational moments. When did you learn something new that changes how your outlook on life goes? I do this by exposing students to the stories of ordinary citizens who have changed society. And they take students to places in the area from which they came and where extraordinary events occur. So lots of my research in the last few years has been looking at who are people who, or events, or people, or what are events that have happened just in this region, even within 2 hours of here. Now, Philadelphia, you can imagine, has a lot of those kinds of moments, but there are other places in the area that I look at, and I'll talk about those depending on how we have time today. So my hope is to strengthen regional histories and an understanding of that, facilitate difficult conversations, and then try to nurture political conversations, or conversations across political divides. That's done through what some would call a transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary kind of framework. And what I figured out is that what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other person. So if there was one way to just really work at this, we would have figured that out by now. We would have tried to push ahead. So thinking about education, exposure, being self-reflective, moral appeals, emotional appeals, practical consequences, all these lead to tools for having difficult conversations, especially in classroom spaces. And then thinking about the transformational experiences where I call these peace and justice journeys. So where have students been doing that? I create experiences rooted in the history and peoples of the WCU region. These journeys provide students with transformative experiences by taking them to places with social justice or moral significance. They also serve to make more concrete the course materials and conversations that we engage in. So basically, I say to students, this semester you have 5 places you could choose to go. Or 5 things that you could choose to do. You're gonna read about one of those people or events. You might watch a documentary related to that, and then I want you to physically go to the place where that thing happened. So I can give you a few examples of that. Byron Rustin, who is connected to the community, is from Westchester. He was the organizer for the March on Washington. He was also an out gay Black man in the 1950s, who was working with Dr. King and several different civil rights leaders. He's from Westchester, and what I do is I have students read an excerpt from a couple of books related to him, watch the documentary Brother Outsider, and then I say, here are 3 locations significant to Rustin's life in Westchester, all of which are in walking distance of the university. Go visit those places. Get a selfie of yours being there, and then I want you to come back and reflect on what it was like to read about that thing, to learn about that thing, and then reflect on it. So the places typically are St. Paul's Church parking lot, which is where his house, one of his houses used to be. Another one is the Hotel Warner. If you don't know the history of Westchester too well, Hotel Warner was actually the Warner Theater. When Rustin was in middle school and high school, if you were Black, you had to sit in the balcony. You couldn't sit down on the main floor. So he and a group of friends made a ruckus about it, made some noise about that being a problem for them, and they actually left the theater at one evening and went to dinner in downtown Westchester at a place that had a sign for whites only. And that was his first arrest. That was his first act of activism. So I have students go down to the Hotel Warner and figure out what it would mean to be in that segregated space. And then finally, I have them go to Henderson High School. Henderson High School is where Rustin attended, and there's a placard outside the high school that says that he attended there. And although there's a Rustin High School, Henderson is actually the high school that he went to while he was here. But that's one example. Another example is I have students read about the 1971 media FBI break-in. So if you, again, not familiar with that, in 1971, a group of anti-war activists primarily broke into what was a satellite FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. It was just up the street from the courthouse. They were they quote unquote liberated the files, which means they basically stole the files. They went through the files, and what they found was that the FBI was conducting illegal activity against activists, primarily those who were using First Amendment expressions. So, and they were tracking all of this. It was labeled as COINTELPRO, which is counterintelligence program. That later becomes important because COINTELPRO becomes a part of the conversations around state secrets and what happens when someone exposes state secrets. So Watergate is impacted by that. We see some of the current WikiLeaks related to that. That happened. They were never caught for breaking in. They basically waited until the statute of limitations was over, and then they came out because the person who basically put all of that together was dying of cancer, and they wanted to make sure the story got told. So there's a documentary. It actually, one of the premieres was here on campus. There were people from the group who came to campus and talked. But what I have students do is go through those materials and then go over to media, to the FBI office. The last one that I'll mention is not quite so, is a little more emotional for many people, which is that there was a Black man named Zachariah Walker who was lynched in 1911, just about a mile outside of Coatesville. There's also a memorial placard there for him. So I have students read about what that story was, how that story was told, and where those incidents took place, and then have them go to that particular location. So the point is to try to, one, make people more aware of the kind of regional histories that are going on, and to live into trying to understand the communities where we are a little bit better, and creating a space for them to say, oh, that was pretty powerful to go to those places and make it more real for them. So, those are some of the, experiences, and generally, the reception to that has been positive by students. Some students are like, I have to go do this assignment outside of class, it's gonna take time. I made that a significant assignment because it does take time. They have to read the materials, probably watch something, and then they have to figure out travel back and forth and writing it up. So, yeah, so those are some of the ways that I start to think about, at least in my classroom spaces, how do we start to break down some of the polarization? So, oh, I didn't understand that about Coastal. Oh, I didn't know things like that happened in media. What kinds of communities are we engaging in? And are we currently a part of? And I often talk about a peace educator named Elise Boulding in my classes. Elise Boulding, she and her husband were peace educators in the 1980s. They were responsible for helping establish peace studies as it is as a discipline now. They thought about peace communities a lot, and their outside of the classroom activities were around nuclear proliferation. So they're trying to figure out, how do we get rid of the nuclear weapons that we've created? But one of the things that I like about Boulding is that she wants us to think about what's going on in the current moment, what's happened in the past, and how that's connected to the future. And so she has this idea that she calls the 200-year present. For Boulding, the 200-year present is basically the 100 years that happened prior to you being born are still alive and well and impacting your life right now. And then you impact the next 100 years. If you want to think about that in a more literal way, think about the oldest person who held you as a baby. I just went through this over the weekend, went home to Indiana. My mom just had a birthday. My niece just had a baby. So literally, when my mom is holding that child, there are several decades worth of history that that child is physically connected to in that particular moment. And when you start to think about history that way, some of the things that we talk about people needing to be over, the things that are around, like, well, we moved on past that, are actually very much still present in how we function and operate today. So then the question becomes, what are we leaving for that next generation or two of people that are coming after us? That's not a completely new idea. Communities have been doing that kind of thing for a long time. But what I like about the 200-year president, so I think about, just to reveal my age, born in 1973. So what's going on in the United States in 1873? Right, we're coming through Reconstruction. We're getting ready to go into Jim Crow segregation. We're starting to think about, again, how the states have reinforced racialized discrimination. And then, of course, right before I'm born, we're getting into all kinds of different movements. So that's had a direct impact on my life. So when someone says, that happened a long time ago, you should get over it. I'm still in touch with civil rights elders, people who are part of the civil rights movement, whose great-grandparents were slaves. Like, these people are still alive. We can physically reach out and talk to them. And so what I like about that 200-year present is thinking about the immediacy of the past. But as I start to think about that in terms of sustainable development, like what kind of restoration and reparations and those sort of things do we have to do in relationship work with communities, what's been pulled out of communities, what's still in community. That's what conflict transformation is really about, that kind of relationship. So some questions that I would have. How do people know you are safe? You don't have to answer that. I'll read through the questions, but just to frame this. So if building a better future for everyone means that we have to have better relationships with one another, how is it that someone knows you're safe? Right. So do you know your neighbors? Do you know the names of the people you live next door to? If they were in trouble, do they know they can come to your house to ask, or to your room, or wherever that is, to get help? Do you feel like you could go to them? Right. This is a part of of bringing that relational component together. How do we begin to walk the walk, as Boggs would have us say, of sustainability and solidarity? What does that start to look like every day? If building sustainability is based on developing relationships, how do we start to do this work in public spaces? It's really easy for me to say, this is what I do in my classroom, because my classroom is a captive space. I have some control over what's going on in there. People have made a general commitment to being in that space. But how do you move that out into a more public? How do you start to break down those things going? So this is really what I've been wrestling with. And I don't have a really good answer at this point. But I think we have to take advantage of the spaces that we have access to in order to start some process. And then finally, Boggs says we've moved from the space of thinking about rights. So we do talk a lot about what are our human rights, what are our individual rights. And she really wants to press upon us. And this was happening in 2012 through the time that she died. And is what does it mean to be responsible? So the conversation moves away from my personal rights to how am I being responsible for the people around me? Does that mean you're accountable for their actions? Not necessarily. But if you see someone who's houseless, how are you contributing to that? How are you engaging that? Might be a question. When we see that going around with the US role in the economies of the world and consumption of the world, those sort of things. What are we doing? And not just as individuals, but how do we press on the systems that we built around that? So those are some of the questions that I'll leave y'all with. If we have a few minutes, I want to be just conscious of time. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to hear what people are thinking about, what they evoked in that. Yeah. Cheryl, I thought you had your hand up because of your picture.
Oh, I have a question. I just always go first and I feel like a conversational pig. That just the last section that you were talking about just brought back this scene to me. And I'm trying to like pull it in, but I live on a section of road where when it snows, there will be some kind of event. So last snowstorm, whenever in the heck that was, 40 years ago or something, there was a car that went into this ditch and a woman of color had been driving that car. And, you know, some people, well, who could stop? It was bad weather, but then this big truck with chains and things stopped. And a guy got out with a MAGA hat and he helped this woman out of the ditch. And it just, for me, it was kind of thinking about, well, relationships, right? We need to be in touch more with people in order to deal with all of our catastrophes. But in some ways, catastrophe causes those relationships sometimes. And then I start thinking about climate change, which is so diffuse that we can't help each other get to a sustainable future in relationship to climate change, because we can't bridge that gap because the problem is so it's in our faces, but not in our faces. There's no question there, Dean, but I don't know, do you talk about the types of situations that help create the relationships besides like creating or how those safe spaces are created across such differences? Do what you want, or just ignore this question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question and it's a difficult question. And that's when I say, like, we have to figure out what spaces do we have access to make those sort of things happen. Because, you know, I'll just say, I've done a lot of anti-oppression workshops, anti-racism kinds of workshops, and I can be seen in certain spaces as a safe person to come talk to. But like when I walk off campus, I look like any other 50-year-old white guy, right? So why am I trustworthy based on what someone's impression might be. And so I don't have a really good answer for that, other than saying, how do we get into spaces with people who might be different than us? How do we get into the spaces where we think we're all the same, and we need to actually have real conversations about where things overlap and why we stay in those spaces. But like, even how do we use public libraries to have conversations? Some of these conversations used to take places in like union buildings or clubs like the Eagles and the Moose and the Legion and those sort of things. Like, people would just be sitting around and having, some of that has been intentionally deflated in a way that people don't have the bandwidth. I'm coming in, I don't want to talk about the heavy. I'm just trying to get through my day and make sure I can feed my family and those sort of things. And so part of it is also dealing with kind of the consequences of people not having the bandwidth to just have a conversation. Most people don't want to talk about politics. So where the polarization is happening is actually among people who are most politically engaged. Those who are not politically engaged, it's kind of like, I'm just trying to make it through. That person over there is just trying to make it through too. I'm going to help them out. So part of it is kind of amping down the level of polarization in the political rhetoric, I think is, and I don't know how to make that happen necessarily. Yeah. If I did, I could probably be really good consultant to be making lots of money off of that with other people, but that's capitalism. So. Yeah.
I feel like the high degree of polarization that you were mentioning maybe ramped up more after the year 2000, the election during that time, and then some distrust growing. But since then, it looked like people were more accepting of the institutions and so forth, and the concept of I guess the Machiavellianism that you were alluding to seems more to me to be a more recent phenomenon that perhaps could, if it doesn't take firm root, just be unique to one's particular situation, that for maybe about 8 years or so. But for the most part, the US tends not to go that route.
Right. Yeah, and we've had opportunities to go that route, and we seem to kind of repeatedly kind of walk up to the edge of that and then walk away from it. Right? So even if you think about what happens post 9/11, right? We had some choices about, are we going to take military action, or are we going to look at development as the model of maybe working out of this? And there was a push for both of those. And we tended to lean in one direction rather than the other. And I think it then adds to some of that. So when we have had choices to make, do we join the Paris Accords? Do we not join the Paris Accords? We look at how countries are responding. All of that spins together pretty quickly, and I do think, according to the research done at Carnegie right now, Carnegie's big push is really around polarization and how are we going to deal with that in an effective way. And the research does show that this has been building up for decades. This is not just something that all at once we happened upon. It's, as you're saying, like, it seemed to be better before this particular point, and it has gotten worse. The mark for that tends to be the Bush-Gore election and how that was decided in the courts. And from that kind of moment on, it seems to think that people skewed away from the trusting the systems to work the way they should. So some people were really happy about that, obviously. Other people were not very happy about that at all. And we see that dynamic then start to work through that process. And then that's also about the time that we start to see the post-90s big divides from different groups taking over different parts of their political parties. So we get, eventually we get the Tea Party, which has an impact on the Republican Party. We start to see a growing push within the Democratic Party from a more progressive wing. And then we start to feel those divides play out.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Starting with a short comment, I appreciate very much your linking the work that you've been doing for a long time, thinking about relationships, solidarity, and community, and connecting into this concept of sustainability. In our work, we try to make that connection, but often sustainability is thought of as environmental sustainability and a focus on ecological issues.
Sure.
Those remain important, and many communities, whether place-based or spiritual, will talk about relationships to the natural world and to other living creatures and to the land on which we are living our lives. How does that connect to some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, it tends to be in faith-based communities where I've had more of that kind of conversation, but I think for me, a lot of it goes back to thinking about how systems are all tied together. And so I do have a systems approach to my work that moves beyond, that is like this, we are in this web of relationships, but also, when I read the Dr. King quote about a revolution of values, and he talks about those triplets of evil and how those things are connected together. So just even thinking about, say, the military industrial complex. Military has an outsized impact on climate. You think about what's added into terms of CO2 and those sort of things, but the military also has an impact then on where other kinds of spending go on within the larger US framework of things. So I tend to talk about things like that. And when I start to think about relationships, like where are we seeing the most violence taking place in society, it tends to be in places where there's a lack of education, there's a lack of healthcare, there's a lack of jobs, right? That people are in a survival mode. So in order to build anything that looks sustainable in that space, they're not even going to start to think about kind of environmental issues by the same way. For example, because I'm just trying to figure out how to make it from day to day. So it really is kind of pulling on the different strings and saying we have to unravel this all at once. And when I say outsized impact on the climate and on the economy, for example, we have a military that's as big as the next 11 countries combined. Depending on which number you're looking at in the last 5 years, somewhere between 45 and 52 cents of every federal tax dollar is spent toward either current or past military endeavors. So questions that, say, someone like Sanders was raising a couple of presidential campaigns ago was, what if we pull back a little bit on military spending and we increase that in education and in healthcare? Right? Do we need to be as big as the next 11 countries combined, or could we be okay with the next 5? Right, and what would that do? And then when we start to unravel what that looks like relationally, we can start to then look at also the global and international impact that has. So in a place like Iraq, at one point, the US had 26 military bases. It's not a very big landmass to have 26 military bases, but we did. And so look at how much of the economy is going toward that rather than some other things. Again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved in conflicts and what's going on internationally. I'm not trying to make that argument, but it is a question of then the relational component of that, and then what things can't we do because this is where the priorities have tended to.
I think it's a start of a conversation about this. Right? We are at 12:50 and we normally pause here because many people have to get to another class, perhaps you do too. But often if the conversation is ongoing and the speaker can continue, we'll continue after that. But because we're at 12:50, please join me in thanking Professor Johnson for and for those of you who do have to leave, please remember we have a full program of presentations this semester. If you're here in person, the schedule, there are print copies at the front of the room. Please take a copy before you go. And for those of you online, you can find the full program on our website.